Half an hour outside Cooktown in far north Queensland, a mountain sits in the middle of open savanna that has been swallowing people for over 150 years. Not metaphorically, people walk toward it and do not come back. Search parties sent to find them do not come back. And in at least one case, the party sent to find the search party did not come back either. Scientists have been trying to explain this for decades, and what the most recent investigation actually found is not what anyone expected, not even close, what you are actually looking at. The first thing to understand about Black Mountain is that it is not actually black. I know, the name is right there, but stay with me. What you're looking at when you see that dark, imposing pile of boulders rising out of the green savanna is granite. Pale, ordinary granite of exactly the kind you would find in countless other formations across the continent. The color that makes it so visually arresting, that deep, almost charcoal darkness that makes it look like something scorched or cursed, depending on your personal threshold for drama, comes from a thin biological crust sitting on the surface of the rock. A combination of lichen and algae that has been slowly colonizing the exterior of those boulders over an enormous period of time, darkening them to the point where the mountain looks from a distance like something that belongs in a completely different landscape than the one surrounding it, which in a geological sense it kind of does. Geologists describe Kalkajaka as a granite formation that solidified from magma deep underground millions of years ago. Over an almost incomprehensible span of time, the softer rock surrounding it eroded away, leaving the harder granite exposed at the surface. What remains is not a mountain in any conventional sense. You cannot walk up a slope to the top. There is no ridgeline, no gentle gradient, no path that naturally presents itself to someone standing at the base looking up. What there is instead is an enormous chaotic jumble of granite boulders stacked against each other at every angle imaginable. Some of these boulders are the size of houses. They are not fused together, they are simply balanced against each other by gravity, creating a three-dimensional labyrinth of narrow gaps, deep fissures, sudden vertical drop-offs, and hidden chambers that extend well below whatever you can see from the surface. There is almost no soil anywhere on the formation. Almost no vegetation manages to take hold in the gaps between the rocks. And here is the part that matters for everything that comes later. A person or an animal that slips into one of those gaps does not just fall a short distance and land somewhere visible. They can fall much further than any observer above would expect, into voids that cannot be seen, cannot be heard from, and in many cases cannot be safely reached, even by professional search and rescue teams, equipped with ropes and specialist caving equipment. Park authorities do not let visitors climb Black Mountain, not because of some bureaucratic overcaution of the kind that puts warning labels on stepladders, because the terrain genuinely cannot support safe access or safe rescue. There is no marked trail, there is no safety infrastructure, there are no barriers partway up because there is no safe point at which to install one. Visitors are asked to observe the mountain from designated lookout points on the surrounding road. That restriction, a landmark you are actively prevented from approaching the closer you get to it, is part of what has shaped its reputation for more than a century. And that reputation is considerable. The name that warned everyone first, the Kuku-Yalanji people have always known this place, and they gave it a name that tells you exactly what kind of place it is before you have taken a single step toward it. Kalkajaka, generally translated as place of the spear. That is not a welcoming name. It is not the kind of name you give somewhere you want people to gather and relax. It is a name with a warning embedded directly into it. A warning that existed for an enormous span of time before any European account of missing travelers, any newspaper headline, any campfire story about the mountain's dangers. The people who named this place had already arrived at a conclusion about it long before colonial settlement brought a new wave of people who had not yet learned to treat the name as information. According to dreaming stories held by traditional owners, Kalkajaka was the site of a significant ancestral battle. Harold Ludwig, a descendant of the Western Yalanji and Gugu Yimithir clans with traditional ownership of this country, has described it as a sacred battlefield, specifically the site of the last spear fight between the Black Cockatoo and White Cockatoo clans, a conflict between inland and coastal groups fought over contested hunting grounds in which many people died. According to the story, the remains of those who died were placed within the mountain itself, inside the rock. A separate dreaming version, also recorded from traditional owners, describes two giants who were both in love with the same woman piling up the granite boulders that now form the mountain as weapons in their fight against each other. A battle that ended when they killed one another and left their stone piles behind as a permanent record of the conflict. Both versions carry the same core understanding. This is a place shaped by violence and by death, and the remains of that history are still inside it. Beyond the specific battle stories, Kalkajaka has always been treated by the Kuku-Yalanji as a place of genuine spiritual danger, distinct even from other significant sacred sites in the surrounding area. Sites like Kambi, Julbanu, and Brimbam all carry religious importance and are approached and understood within their own specific cultural framework, but Kalkajaka is treated differently. With a different weight, a different category of caution, traditional owners do not enter Kalkajaka, they observe it from a distance, and visitors today are asked to respect that same boundary. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it is easy to hear that instruction as a cultural preference to be politely acknowledged and quietly set aside. What it actually represents is something far older and more specific than a preference. It is accumulated knowledge, the kind of knowledge that only develops when a community has existed in close relationship with a particular landscape for long enough to understand what it actually does to people who approach it without the right preparation and the right understanding. The Kuku-Yalanji arrived at the correct conclusion about Kalkajaka long before anyone else had a chance to be wrong about it. That is not a small thing. And it becomes considerably more significant once you have heard everything science has since worked out about the place, the disappearances, what the records actually say. European accounts of disappearances at Black Mountain begin appearing in historical records not long after colonial settlement reached the region, and they accumulate in a way that is genuinely striking, even before you start looking closely at the specific details of each case. In 1872, according to local accounts, a courier named Philip Granger went missing while searching for a stray calf near the mountain. A search was conducted. Neither Granger nor any trace of the calf was ever found. 10 years later, in 1882, police searched for two missing cattlemen named Harry Owens and George Hawkins, who had gone missing in the vicinity of the mountain. One of the two men eventually reappeared, but was reportedly unable to give any coherent account of what had happened to him or where he had been during the time he was missing, which, depending on your preferred interpretation, is either deeply mysterious or consistent with the kind of disorientation and psychological shock that follows a genuinely harrowing physical experience in extreme terrain. Then there is the story of Sugarfoot Jack, a bushranger, which is to say an outlaw, who by the existing accounts reasoned that the mountain was the one place in the district his pursuers would be genuinely reluctant to follow him. He and several companions reportedly took refuge near Kalkajaka following a shootout. The police search that followed found nothing. No men, no horses, no possessions. The story of what happened to Sugarfoot Jack has no satisfying ending because there is no ending, which is, narratively speaking, exactly the kind of detail that keeps a campfire story alive across generations. In 1928, a prospector named Q. Packer went missing while searching the area for gold or gemstones. His body was later recovered, found with a gunshot wound and his rifle nearby. The circumstances were never conclusively established. Accident, misadventure, something else? The record does not say. Another traveller found dead near the mountain in 1932, under circumstances that contemporary accounts described as unexplained. By the time you have read through these cases in sequence, you can see exactly how the nickname arrived. Local stories began calling Kalkajaka Australia's own Bermuda Triangle, a place where the normal rules governing what happens to people seem suspended, where official explanations arrived late or incomplete or not at all. The pattern continued well into living memory. As recently as 2001, two campers near the base of the mountain reported seeing what they described as a large dark mass moving toward their campsite in the middle of the night before it apparently vanished in front of them. Whatever actually happened that night, the two men packed up immediately and left, rather than waiting until morning, which is honestly a completely understandable response to seeing a large dark mass moving toward you in the dark near a mountain that has already eaten several people. You do not need to be superstitious to make that call. The phenomena nobody could explain. Alongside the disappearances, a separate body of folklore grew up around Black Mountain, describing phenomena experienced by people who never set foot on the rocks at all. Pilots flying over the area have for decades reported unusual instrument behavior. There has long been a general reluctance among local aviators to fly directly over the mountain, a reluctance that, in aviation culture, tends to get passed between pilots the way all good cautionary knowledge does, quietly, seriously, without much interest in whether the person listening finds it dramatic. In the 1990s, a formal magnetic survey was conducted to determine whether the granite formation carried unusual magnetic properties capable of interfering with aircraft instruments. The survey found no significant magnetic anomaly at the site, no unusual magnetic field, no measurable geological property that could explain the reported instrument behavior, which either means the instrument reports were exaggerated, or it means the explanation for them is something the survey was not designed to detect, or it means something else entirely. The survey, in other words, resolved the question less completely than its existence might suggest. Other accounts describe low moaning sounds emanating from within the rock pile, a phenomenon researchers have generally attributed to wind moving through the countless narrow gaps and chambers between the boulders, or to the boulders themselves shifting slightly under their own considerable weight, both of which are entirely plausible physical explanations that would, nevertheless, be extremely alarming to hear in the dark near a mountain with this particular reputation. Visitors have also consistently reported something harder to categorize, a generalized, difficult to articulate sense of unease simply from standing at the lookout and looking at the mountain from a safe distance. Some people attribute this to the stark visual contrast between the dark, apparently lifeless rock and the green, living landscape surrounding it on every side. Others connect it more directly to the weight of the stories they already knew before arriving, the sense that you are looking at a place with a particular history and that the place is aware of being looked at. I'm not going to tell you that is not real, because I think anyone who has stood at that lookout and felt it knows it is a real experience. What it is an experience of is a separate question. What the historian found in 2022, a Cooktown-based historian named Bev Shea conducted a detailed investigation into the disappearance stories that had been repeated about Black Mountain for well over a century. Her findings, reported through the ABC, did not confirm a supernatural explanation, but they also did not simply dismiss the mountain's reputation as pure invention. What she found was something more specific than either of those positions, and in its own way, more unsettling. Shea traced the most widely repeated disappearance stories back through the layers of retelling to the original records. What she found was that a significant number of those stories, in the form they are most commonly told, do not hold up. Details had changed between versions, names shifted, dates moved by years, or in some cases decades, depending on who was telling the story and when. Incidents that had occurred at entirely different locations had been quietly absorbed into the Black Mountain narrative over time, attached to the mountain's existing reputation because the mountain was already the obvious place to put a vague or half-remembered tragedy. As Shea put it directly, when you actually look closely at the claims, a significant number of them simply are not accurate in the form they are usually told. This is not a comfortable finding. It is also not a surprising one. If you know anything about how folklore works, what happened at Black Mountain over more than a century is not unique to this particular mountain. It is what happens whenever a real place with a genuinely unusual history becomes the kind of place people tell stories about. The stories start with something real, they get retold. Each retelling smooths out the uncertain details and sharpens the dramatic ones. Incidents that happened elsewhere get folded in because the location already has the right atmosphere. The eerie version of a story survives the retelling process far more reliably than the mundane version, and over enough generations, the mythology surrounding a place becomes so much larger than the verifiable history beneath it that disentangling the two requires the kind of patient, systematic archival work that Shay actually did. None of this means nothing ever happened at Black Mountain. Shay did not find that. What she found was that the verified history of the place, the things that can actually be confirmed against original records, is smaller and less theatrical than the accumulated mythology suggests. Real tragedies occurred, real people went missing, the exact number, the precise circumstances, and the names of everyone involved had simply been blurred by more than a century of campfire retellings and newspaper embellishment, and the very human tendency to remember the version of a story that makes the hair on your arms stand up, rather than the version that explains it away. The mythology was built on something real. It had simply grown much larger than what was underneath it. What scientists actually discovered here is the part the headlines love to skip over. Because the real explanation for what happened at Black Mountain, the mechanism by which real people in real documented cases went missing and were never found, is not supernatural. It is not magnetic. It is not the result of any anomalous geological property that a survey failed to detect. It is the terrain. Specifically, it is the intersection of a particular kind of terrain with a particular set of conditions that made conventional search and rescue not just difficult, but in specific documented cases, physically impossible. A person who falls into one of Kalkajaka's deep, narrow fissures does not land somewhere a searcher standing above can see. The geometry of the boulder pile means that a gap wide enough at the surface to admit a person can narrow dramatically below, creating a shaft or chamber that is invisible from any angle above ground level. There is no sight line into it. There is no scent trail accessible to tracking dogs once someone has fallen far enough below the surface. There is frequently no safe path for a rescue team to physically reach the location, even once they have identified roughly where the person went in, because the surrounding boulders are not stable enough to move without risk of destabilizing the entire formation and burying anyone already inside, along with anyone trying to get to them. Search and rescue teams have on multiple documented occasions been physically unable to safely access certain voids at all, not unwilling, unable. The mountain is not keeping people from going in out of some mysterious force. It is keeping them out the way any three-dimensional granite puzzle keeps out anyone who does not know its specific architecture, by being physically impassable without the right knowledge of where to go. Now add the factors that compound this. The area is remote, genuinely remote in the way that far north Queensland was remote in the 1870s and 1880s, which meant that disappearances were frequently not reported for days. By the time a search began, whatever trail existed had already gone cold. The terrain between the mountain and the nearest settlement made a methodical grid search extraordinarily difficult to conduct, and the specific kind of terrain at the mountain itself meant that a standard surface search, the kind that works in open country, was almost entirely useless. Waterways in the vicinity carry their own separate risks. Crocodiles are not a metaphor in this part of Queensland. They are a genuine and well-documented hazard in the waterways and swimming holes near the base of the mountain. A number of disappearances in the broader region that were absorbed into the Black Mountain narrative over time likely had nothing to do with the mountain at all, and everything to do with the waterways surrounding it. Heat, disorientation, unfamiliarity with the terrain, and straightforwardly poor decision-making in extreme conditions have all been identified as contributing factors in specific documented cases. These are the same mundane causes responsible for disappearances in dangerous remote terrain anywhere else in the world. They do not require anything additional. They are entirely sufficient on their own. Here is the thing about genuinely hazardous terrain. It does not need to be mysterious to be deadly. It needs to be steep or unstable or disorienting or remote enough that help cannot arrive in time. Kalkajaka is all of those things simultaneously. It is a three-dimensional granite labyrinth in the middle of remote far north Queensland, with hidden voids that professional rescue teams cannot safely access, surrounded by waterways with crocodiles in a climate where dehydration and heat exhaustion can incapacitate a person within hours. The mountain is not supernatural, it is just extraordinarily, specifically, almost elegantly dangerous in a way that the people who knew it best understood long before anyone else had a chance to find out the hard way. That is what scientists actually found at Black Mountain. Not a magnetic anomaly, not an interdimensional portal, not evidence of anything that falls outside the normal operation of physics and geology and the particular cruelty of remote Australian terrain. The explanation for why people who went missing at Kalkajaka so often were never found is the terrain itself, operating exactly as difficult terrain operates, without any additional assistance from the supernatural. This is either reassuring or deeply unsatisfying, depending on what you came here hoping to hear. I understand both responses, but I would argue the real explanation is actually more remarkable than the supernatural one, for reasons I will get to in a moment. The thing nobody talks about: there is a version of this story that ends with the terrain explanation and moves on. Mystery solved, more or less. A dangerous geological formation, a mythology that outgrew its foundations, a historian who did the archival work to separate what was real from what was retold. Satisfying, responsible, done. But that version of the story leaves out the part that I think is actually the most significant thing about Kalkajaka, the part that does not get nearly enough attention in any account of this mountain I have ever read, the Kukuyalanji already knew. Not approximately, not in a vague spiritual sense that could be interpreted generously as containing some useful practical wisdom. They knew specifically, in the particular way you know something when your community has lived in direct relationship with a specific landscape for long enough to understand exactly what it does. The name Kalkajaka, place of the spear, was not decorative, it was functional, it was information. It told anyone who heard it what kind of place this was before they had taken a single step toward it. Traditional owners do not enter Kalkajaka. They have not entered it within living cultural memory. The boundary around the mountain is not a recent safety measure retrofitted onto an existing tradition. It is the tradition. The understanding that this specific place required a different kind of relationship than the surrounding country had been embedded in Kukuyalanji culture for an enormous span of time before the first European in the region had any reason to wonder where a missing courier had gone. Think about what that means in practice. For every disappearance in the colonial record, for every case that eventually became part of the mountain's mythology of the inexplicable, there is a prior reality in which the people who actually knew this country had already established a clear and sensible protocol for interacting with it. Do not go in. Observe from a distance. Treat it with the specific kind of respect that a genuinely dangerous place commands. That knowledge was ignored. Not through malice necessarily, although the broader colonial context is not a story about people treating Aboriginal knowledge with appropriate seriousness. It was ignored the way all unfamiliar knowledge gets ignored by people who are confident they do not need it, confident that a mountain is just a mountain, that a warning embedded in a name is folklore rather than information, that the people who had been living here for thousands of years and had developed a very specific relationship with this very specific place probably did not know anything a competent European explorer with a rifle and a compass could not figure out on his own. They were wrong about that. The historical record of what happened to the people who walked toward Kalkajaka without the Kukuyalanji's accumulated understanding of the place is, in its own grim way, a demonstration of exactly how wrong that confidence turned out to be. There is something else sitting in this history that is worth naming directly. By the time the colonial disappearances at Black Mountain began accumulating into the mythology we now recognize, the Kuku-Yalanji people who held the specific knowledge about this place were already living through the systematic destruction of their world, disease, frontier violence, forced removal from country, the same process that was playing out across the continent, compressing thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about specific landscapes into a generation or two of catastrophic loss. The people who understood Kalkajaka were not in a position to be consulted about it. Their understanding of the place had been categorized, along with everything else they knew, as something that did not count as knowledge in the framework the newcomers had brought with them. That is the history sitting underneath the mystery, and it is darker and more specific and more consequential than anything the campfire stories ever got around to mentioning. Why? It still matters. Black Mountain is not a haunted mountain. The scientific record does not support a supernatural explanation for what happened there. The most rigorous historical investigation conducted in the last decade found that the mythology surrounding the site had grown considerably larger than the verified events beneath it, and that the physical characteristics of the terrain itself are entirely sufficient to explain the genuine tragedies that did occur. None of that makes Kalkajaka a less remarkable place. It makes it a more remarkable one. What you are looking at when you stand at that lookout on the road outside Cooktown is a genuinely hazardous geological formation that a community of traditional owners understood with total clarity long before anyone else had an opportunity to learn about it the hard way. A place whose traditional name carried a specific and accurate warning across an enormous span of time. A landscape that generated one of the most persistent and dramatic mystery traditions in regional Australian folklore on the basis of a smaller number of real events than the stories suggest, because the real events were genuinely strange enough, and the terrain genuinely dangerous enough, and the mythology building instinct in human storytelling genuinely powerful enough to do exactly that. The mountain does not need ghosts, it does not need magnetic anomalies or interdimensional passages, or any of the explanations that the more enthusiastic accounts of its history have reached for over the decades. It was always dangerous enough on its own terms, in exactly the way the Kuku-Yalanji understood it to be, in exactly the way the name they gave it said it was, long before a single word about missing couriers or vanished cattle or baffled search parties was ever written down. The most remarkable thing scientists found at Black Mountain is not a new geological phenomenon or an unexplained physical property. It is that the oldest account of the place, the one embedded in the traditional name, the one held by the people who knew this country before anyone else had arrived to be confused by it, turned out to be the most accurate account available. That is not a mystery. That is a lesson, and it is one this continent has been trying to teach anyone paying attention for a very long time. If this changed how you see a place you thought was just another outback legend, leave it in the comments, and subscribe for more ancient Australian history that has been hiding in plain sight the entire time.